This is the Power Break Podcast number 197, titled From the Bottom to the Top. Hi, everyone. I'm Bob Brubaker, along with JT, as we hope you'll stay tuned as we seek to give you a little power in this break to help you succeed in the race of life.
This is the Power Break Podcast, with a focus on the spiritual, the mental, and the physical aspects, all to help you succeed in the race of life. For show notes from today's podcast, go to BobBrubaker.com and follow the link for the Power Break Podcast. What's up with you, man?
Well, I was actually taking our own advice. I didn't want to work out this morning, but I just said, give it 5 good minutes and see what happens. So I got a good walk in with Jan, I lifted weights, and I swam.
Wow, you went from nothing to like a superhero. That's pretty impressive. Yeah, I did no such thing. I came home. I knew I had a bunch of like today was like bill day since it's the beginning of the month. So took care of that. I had some outside stuff I had to do. No workout though, man. So I'm impressed with you. That's good.
But it looks like you took time to get a haircut.
I did last week. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Nice of you to notice.
It's like the guy that walked out of church and while he was walking out, he walked out on the pastor, and the pastor said, "Where are you going?" And the man says, "I'm going to get a haircut." And the pastor said, "Why didn't you get a haircut before you came to church?" He said, "I didn't need one then."
Oh, wow. That's a nice shot on the
ding,
pastor.
Ding, 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 ding,
I like it. Yeah.
Well, let's let everybody know that we appreciate their listening. Thank you so much for listening to the Power Break Podcast. Thank you for telling your friends about the podcast, and thank you for leaving a rating and or a review wherever you download the podcast. The word is getting out. We appreciate it. Our listenership seems to be going up. So we give you thanks for that. Thank the Lord for the opportunity. And JT, it's just great to be able to continue this podcast.
Nope, I agree completely. You know, it was a big question mark, I think, how we were going to get it done once I went up to North Carolina. But I think we're still putting out something that people appreciate. So I'm very grateful for that.
We found a system, and it works as long as that line between North Carolina and Florida stays clear.
Yeah, and there's a lot in between it seems. So,
yeah.
But so far, so good.
So thank you all for listening. And today, JT, we're talking about going from the bottom to the top. What's that bring to your mind right off the bat?
Man, you know, I always think about the times in the valley and the times coming out of the valleys in my life. You know, there's so many times that, you just kind of ride that roller coaster of life. And that's what comes to mind for me. How do you get out of the bottom? And how I've gotten out of the bottom the most effectively has always begun with getting back to basics as far as scripture and getting back to the stuff that I knew I was forgetting, which is how I ended up at the bottom to begin with. So that's what I think of is just, all of us are going to experience the ups and downs. All of us are going to get the benefit of those ups and downs as long as we focus on the lessons that are being taught. And the quickening that's happening as far as God and how He chastens His people. So I think that's the most important thing. And for me, coming out of the bottom and sitting on top, a lot of times I look back and I think, wow, thank God I was at the bottom at that point, because look at what I got out of it once I refocused and started to do what I was supposed to do. So what do you think, man?
Well, what I think is what I'm going to be talking about today is actually in our podcast today, we're going to reach back, since this is episode number 197. We're fast approaching the number 200 episode.
Fast approaching.
So this is reaching back a ways to 2019, and we first talked about the subject of lamenting as the time I was going through the summer series in Psalms here at Christ Community Presbyterian Church, and I go through the Psalms, and a third of the Psalms happen to be laments, and this was the time we brought up lamenting here on the podcast and on of course, the blog, the Power Break blog. So it's based on Psalm 38, verses 21 through 22, where the psalmist says, "Do not forsake me, O Lord, my God, and be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O God of my salvation." So that's what we're talking about. And what it is a lament, and going from the bottom, feeling like things are really, really bad. And God gives us that opportunity in a lament to express that and to find his peace and satisfaction in that time of lamenting. So it's a really fine place to find hope when you're in that, when you feel like you've hit the bottom. Or as my roommate used to say when I was in college, he'd say, "Bob, I'm so low today I have to reach up to touch bottom."
Wow, man, he doesn't sound like a very chipper fella.
Well, he was a very tough football player, but he had his moments where kind of got discouraged. But nevertheless, he was a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. But nevertheless,
awesome.
I appreciated him saying that, because that was being real, and that's what we're going to talk about today. When you're lamenting, when you go through a time of lamenting, it's being real with God and being real about your situation and expressing that to God. So we're going to talk more about that, going from the bottom to the top.
Yeah, let's turn to your blog. Folks, if you haven't been over to bobbrubaker.com, check it out. There's a ton of resources over there. But at the very least, sign up for the blog. It'll come free of charge every Monday morning. And it's a great way for me, honestly, to start my week. A lot of times over the weekend, you kind of have that. You and I have talked about it, especially when, for me, I served on that Sunday. So, I played and was able to worship and really and lead God's people in worship, and it was really cool. But a lot of times on that Monday, man, you're feeling like, what is that?
Exhaustion.
A one-legged man in a butt kicking contest or whatever. You're just feeling like, man. So
it's called exhaustion.
Is that what it is? You just mentally kind of, I think you're right. But man, that, the MailChimp makes sure that on Monday I have something to read and get me refocused. So I appreciate it. But let's continue to talk more about from the bottom to the top.
Well, as I wrote in the blog that, and again, we're reaching back to 2019 when I first brought this up, but we all face circumstances in which we feel like we've hit the bottom, and that's really part of life. And of course, it'd be nice to get out of that pit and find a way to the top. There are no instant cures, of course, but the Bible's very clear about a way that takes a person from the pit of despair and sets that person on the road to great hope, and it's called a lament. Now, I realize when I bring that up, the first thought on that subject, the word lament conjures up thoughts of pain or agony, singing in a minor key. Well, consider this. A third of the Psalms are actually written as laments, and the other two-thirds you'll find portions of those Psalms that have expressions of lamenting. So No wonder we go to the Psalms when we look for an answer, when we feel like we're in the pit of life. So what's up with this lamenting stuff? Psalm 38, that is, in verses 1 through 4. "Rebuke me not in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath, for your arrows have sunk into me. Your hand has come upon me. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There is no health in my bones because of my sin. My iniquities have gone over my head, and like a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me." I would say that you would say that David felt like he was in the pit. Would you say that, JT?
Yeah, I think that's pretty safe to say.
Well, he goes on to say, I'm feeble and I'm crushed. Okay, he's very open and honest about how he feels. He says, "I groan because of the tumult of my heart, O Lord." And he says, "Lord, my longing is before you, my sighing is not hidden from you." And then he concludes there in verses 21 and 22. He says, "Do not forsake me, O Lord. Do not be far from me. Make haste to help me, O God of my salvation." Now, a lament can be defined as a loud cry, a howl, a passionate expression of grief, or a complaint that is made to God. A lament is more than just a sorrow of expressions of sadness, and is much more than walking through the stages of grief, although all the above may be found in that lament. A lament expresses a belief in God's mercy, redemption, and recognition of his sovereignty, which is a very thing that leads a person to lament, because it's out of trusting that God is good and sovereign that the lament is voiced as a petition to God, expecting God to hear. So a rule of thumb to follow is deciphering laments is in the Bible is to notice 4 key parts, specifically an address to God, the elements of a complaint, honest and open before God, a request, again, that's honest and open, and finally, a word of trust, and it's not necessarily on that order. So stop and think about it. A lament takes us from the pit to the top by expressing trust in God.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. I've been reading Psalms my entire life, but it wasn't until you and I had that conversation and we really dug into laments. And if I remember correctly, your sermons on laments were one of the most listened to sermons on Sermon Audio, just simply because, most people don't talk about a lament and what it's for and the process that's involved in it. But it really is a process. A lot of us don't want to complain to God. We think, something he doesn't want to hear it. It's quite the opposite, isn't it, Bob?
It really is, JT, and because especially when you read in the book of Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy that when God's people complain, they got in big trouble with God.
Yeah, for sure.
But that was not a lament. That was just strictly a complaint.
Yes.
So when you stop and think about it, if you just go around complaining, that's an abomination because what you're saying is God does not have things under control, and you don't like how He's doing things. So He needs to get His act together.
Yeah.
So you're basically blaming Him for what is wrong in life. Now, when you go to a lament, again, you have respect for God in the way that you address Him. So that expresses a trust in Him.
Yep.
Secondly, when you do complain, you might even complain about how you feel like God is treating you, and yet when you come to the request, you ask God to do something about it. So you're actually looking to Him as the sovereign that can do something. And then in that lament somewhere, you express the fact that you believe that God has everything under control and you trust Him to do what is right.
Yeah, that's the key. That's really the big one at the end.
Yeah. So that's why when we we need comfort during the times when we're in the pit. We need some help, some encouragement, and we read the scriptures about the lament. Now, let's just talk about the very fact that we're honest and open before God, and so we're honest and open with each other. And so when we're expressing an attitude of lament, it is actually an honest expression. So how many times when you talk to people, you go to church and say, "How you doing?" And what do they say? "I'm doing good. Yeah, man, everything's right." Yeah. And so we're afraid to be honest about that. If somebody says, "Well, I'm in the pit of life," everybody avoids them, So
that's for sure, yeah.
So even the songs we sing in churches sometimes, we're afraid to sing in that minor key. We're afraid we're going to turn people off. But can you imagine if somebody was, feeling like they're in the pit of life, they go to church and everything's happy, 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 and there's no identity with how we really feel.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think in a lot of ways, there are many, many churches like that. And, there's got to be a conviction to do life together. And I think that's really kind of the key is, a lot of times I know I've been to multiple churches where there's no real life groups. The church is a little bit too big for everybody to know each other. And there's not really a doing of life together. It's more of a going in to hear an inspirational message, maybe hear some nice music, and then you just kind of move on with life. But that's really not what we were designed for. We weren't designed for that, outward appearance of everything's awesome and completely crushed on the inside, right? It's just not how we were designed. So, but something, think about our society with Instagram, Facebook, all those things, that's all you ever see is positive. So no wonder it ended up flowing into our church, right? To where you only see the Facebook side of life, where the reality is we got to do life together. I think that's the key. And a lament is so strong in bringing not only you back to center and back to God, but also each other, right?
Oh, that's right. That's right. Are you familiar with the song "Stricken, Smitten, and Afflicted"?
No. I'm familiar with all those feelings, though.
But it's really a good song, and it is written in a minor key. And we started to sing that here at Christ Community Presbyterian Church. It was appropriate to sing around the Good Friday season and all, because it's about Christ being stricken, smitten, and afflicted. But it is in a minor key, and it's amazing how the song attracted everyone. Everybody was talking about how it was going through their mind during the week. And I was thinking about that's a fellow by the name of Carl Trueman. He's a podcaster and a theologian, and he was talking about how the church has lost its ability to sing in the minor key because in doing so, bringing songs in the minor key actually touches the heart of a person that is in the pit of life. It actually is a ministry. And so that's exactly what we're talking about. This is what David did when he brings these psalms that are laments and brings them out. And in fact, that we can identify with that. Well, anyway, that's what it's about. So the article, I'd ask you to check it out at bobbrubaker.com. It's called From the Bottom to the Top.
So what else is happening, Bob? Anything you want the listeners to know about?
Well, I thought it'd be appropriate, since we're talking about lamenting, to mention my book, Relief in Suffering, that I just published earlier this year. It is a book about what God has provided for relief in suffering as far as principles from James chapter 5. Check it out. It's at bobbrubaker.com. So go to the resources and scroll through there, or you'll find the books, and then go through the books. You'll find it kind of a dark-looking cloud on the cover with yellow lettering. It says Relief in Suffering. Yeah. And while you're there, check out the sermon links to the sermons I preach here at Christ Community Presbyterian Church, going through the book of 1 Peter at the moment, but looking forward to going through Psalms this summer, beginning with Psalm 75. But let me mention that even this Sunday, it's amazing how, Spurgeon once said, the C.H. Spurgeon, who was a famous preacher in England, said, if you preach to the hurting, you're preaching to someone in every row. And it's really true. And I just noticed, like, this Sunday, I'm preaching from 1 Peter chapter 2, and Peter's dealing with, the attitude you would have as a servant. And then he makes this statement that when you go through suffering, you consider the fact that's your calling.
Wow.
Called to suffer. And, Paul says that in the book of Philippians chapter 1, where he says that not only is it given to you on behalf of Christ to believe in him, so that's a gift, but also to suffer for his name's sake. Wow.
Yeah, that's
anyway. Yeah. That's part of what we're preaching on here, and then you can check it out. The sermon links of the sermons I preach here at Christ Community Presbyterian Church in Clearwater, Florida, and also the book that we're talking about, Relief in Suffering. It's all found at bobbrubaker.com.
Well, this is the Power Break Podcast. I'm JT along with Bob Brubaker, and this is time on the podcast for questions and answers. If you have a question for me or for Bob, feel free to email me at jt@bobbrubaker.com, and we'll get to answering that on an upcoming Power Break podcast. All right, we're going to start from the spiritual as always. You got your helmet on? You ready to go?
The helmet on, yeah. Are you dressed and ready to go? My old football coach used to say it. Be dressed and ready to go.
Well, I got my haircut, so we're good. Let's do it.
You did.
Yeah. All right, so why is it so important for Christians to learn to lament?
We've kind of talked about this, but let's just say it is God's means to deal with disappointments and heartaches of life. So too many times Christians feel like they have to put on the happy, happy look all the time, and otherwise they're just not spiritual, and which is a lie.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's why, as you said, we need to be honest and open with each other. We need to associate with people in churches that, if the church isn't honest and open, we need to find another church maybe. I don't know. I'm looking at this and saying we need to do life together, and part of that doing life together is giving the opportunity for us to be honest and open about how we are really experiencing life. And sometimes we know that life has its ups and downs, and probably more downs than ups, and how we treat that time. And part of that time, when we're down in the pit, we need some help. Not just to say, well, buck up, buddy. Be happy.
Yeah,
put a smile on your face.
It's funny. I actually have, and it's funny. I don't know if I'm going to keep it on my truck or not. But I bought a tag, and this tag is literally it's a tag to go on the front of my truck, and it's to remind me every day to not complain. That's why I got it. Like, it's a reminder for me. But what it says is, shh, nobody cares. Now, I have it on there because people don't genuinely care about my complaints. What they care about is whether I'm following Scripture, whether I'm trying to be righteous, all those things. So, like, it's a reminder for me, but I think people take it the other way, like, I don't want to hear their problems. So I don't know if I'm going to keep it on. I don't know if I'm going to keep it on there or not. But honestly, it was just a reminder for me, like, don't complain. You know, instead, turn it over to God and just move on.
There was a deacon in our church who died several years ago that he was actually in a lot of pain every day of his life.
Really?
And people would ask him how he was doing. And every time he had the same answer. And the answer was, better than I deserve.
Man.
And I asked him about that, and he said, well, Bob, it's the truth, number one. Number two, it's a reminder to me that if I want to just make a complaint, even if I'm in the pits right now with a lot of pain, he says, it's a lot better than what I really deserve.
Yeah.
So,
and that was really kind of my point of putting that tag on there for me to see it every day. Yeah. So, but yeah, you know, the lament teaches you the process of how to kind of get rid of that angst, you know, that.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Because you're gonna have it. It's a feeling that you will develop, but there's a process in how to work your way through to the other side and get back to where you realize, like he said, man, I'm really doing better than I deserve. And God is truly great. So, it's just kind of a process there. It's really important.
Just let me review again those 4 points of lament. And number one, it's just you're totally honest with God, but you first, the way you address God is important. You know, so many times people just almost afraid to talk to him, but you know, he's the Lord of all, and he's the sovereign of heaven and earth, and he's allowed us to come into his presence only by the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we address him with respect and honor, as Jesus said in the model prayer, to our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, right? So we have this respect as we approach him. Secondly, we just honestly and open about how we feel about things and how things really are. And it's amazing. I've asked people in counseling sessions just to be honest and open. Well, tell me exactly how you feel about everything that's going on. Yeah. And people struggle with that. They're afraid to say it. And especially if you make your complaint to God. Well, guess what? He knows exactly how you feel. So if you're going to hide your feelings, you're being dishonest with God.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, there's I think we're afraid of other people judging us, but the simple truth is every single time that I have shared something, like several times, like in police work, you know, we were all kind of thinking the same thing, but nobody wanted to be the guy to say it.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I was like, you know something, man, this really stinks. Or, man, this is really a bad place. And everybody's like, oh, thank you, man. That's exactly what I was thinking. So you're not alone. I promise you.
Right.
Because God made us all in his image, right? So
that's right.
Yeah, you're not alone.
So, you know, again, just being honest with God and telling him your complaint, and then honest as if he says, well, what would you like me to do about that? And you exactly tell him, and then, but another important part of that lament is an expression of trust in his sovereignty and his doing what is best for you, and knowing that he always does what is right and perfect.
Yeah,
anyway.
That's right. That's right. I mean, turn to that prayer that Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane when he said, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done.
There you go. There you go.
And that's just kind of how you leave it. Because, man, talk about someone who knew some really bad stuff was coming.
No, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. All right. So question number 2 from the mental aspect. So what's the key to mentally participating in a lament. So mentally you're there and you're allowing it to work in your kind of thought process.
I recommend reading through the Psalms and notice how many laments or expressions of lament that you find there. I mean, in those four elements. I mean, there are some sad songs that we're going to be covering this summer in the book of Psalms that a fellow by the name of Asaph wrote, and really sad about the destruction of Jerusalem at that time, and just some very sad things. But it's good to notice the honesty of scriptures, in particular the Psalms, and just notice how their expressions there, and then be prepared to write down your own things when times get tough or disappointing, and because you're not made to hold on to these feelings, because when you hold them in, what happens? You turn bitter, and that's a sin. That's a sin.
100%.
So we were not made to pretend that we're to be happy, or that expression, fake it till you make it. No, that's being dishonest. We're designed to be honest with your Creator, and we can do that and find hope and encouragement in times of discouragement by learning to lament.
Yeah, coming, and it helps you rely on the one thing in your life, the one being in your life that is not going to disappoint in any way, right? You may not get what you want, but you really can't be disappointed if God makes a decision about whatever it is that's going on in your life and how that works in the lives of other people. To not become bitter about it is really, really important. So developing that relationship to where you're like, man, I am so unhappy with fill in the blank.
Yeah.
But then recognizing, but God is good, God is in control, and His will needs to be done regardless of mine. And recognizing that and being able to turn that completely over to Him, like Jesus did, nevertheless, your will, not mine, be done, is really important. And it's really hard because we want to kind of trek out on our own and see if we can't fix it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's my goal half the time is like, oh, look at that. That's not going to happen. I'm going to fix that, Yeah. Well, the simple truth is there's hardly any power that I wield when it comes to that thing, because it usually involves other people, which I have no power over. Right.
That's right.
Yeah. So, it's super important. All right. So are you ready for question number 3? We're going to get into the physical aspect of life.
Yeah, let's do that, JT.
All right. So why should athletes consume protein, especially older athletes? I'm going to add that.
Whoa, yeah. Well, that's what this is a hot topic with me, because I found myself being 69, losing some muscle mass and strength. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and he said, well, tell me what you eat. And I told him, he goes, dude, you need more protein.
Dude, that's never what you want to hear. Dude.
Yeah, because believe it or not, especially because I was really consumed with a lot of cycling, long distance stuff and everything else. And he said, what's happening is, man, your body needs so much protein, it starts to break down muscle and take it back.
Yeah.
So anyway, I've learned my lesson, because everybody needs protein. Athletes they have more lean muscle mass, and so they're burning things. They need to be building that up. So we burn up all kinds of protein, but protein is needed for the formation of hemoglobin, which of course carries the oxygen. It's critical for controlling volume and maintaining water balance. It's critical, of course, and it breaks down to amino acids, go into the pool of amino acids which can be drawn from if carbohydrate stores run low. I mean, branched chain amino acids are found in protein, and it's critical for repairing damaged muscles during exercise. So we need it. I know you're more of an expert than I on this subject. So what say you, JT?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert, but I will tell you that, it's really challenging, and I've watched my wife's experience when she became a vegetarian. That is the hardest thing to get, is protein, and enough of it, and high quality protein. But But if you don't have enough protein, your body really doesn't recover the way that it should. And it builds up over time. So, a lot of us are like, oh man, I don't feel like I have the same stamina or I have the same strength that I used to. And a lot of us will turn around and and start to feed ourselves carbohydrates.
Exactly.
That will give us the energy. But the reality is the reason why you don't have that energy is because you didn't rebuild and recover over time because you didn't have enough protein. So,
exactly.
It's when I actually looked at how much protein is recommended by the majority, I kind of have a pool of trainers that I look to for knowledge because they're all very experienced, and they all really kind of agree it's an obscene amount of protein based on what I was eating.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
they say it's 1-to-1 as far as grams per pound.
Yes,
especially
and that's a lot of protein.
Yes.
Yeah.
But he said that's the only way that you keep from destroying muscle mass in your body, and it actually is good for you.
Go ahead. I was just going to say I would encourage people to look at what a lot of the endurance guys eat over time. Like if you watch what they eat during the Tour de France, you've got 21 days of really hard cycling, and as soon as they get off the bike, they get handed basically a big container of protein.
Yeah.
Protein and some carbs, obviously, because they just burnt a ton. But, man, the amount of protein that they force on these guys, it gets to the point to where they're sick of eating, right?
Yeah.
But that's the only way you recover.
Well, what we encourage you to do is take the time, the discipline to check out articles and all on the need for protein. And it does take discipline to make that change in your life. But as we say, discipline does make the difference in all aspects of life. Check out today's show notes at BobBrubaker.com. Click on the Power Break podcast. Today is show number 197.
And submit your questions by email to jt@bobbrubaker.com and listen for our answer on an upcoming Power Break podcast.
Quick word for relief in suffering. We've been talking about suffering or going through the pit today. The relief in suffering is all about that, taken from James chapter 5, some principles to find relief. You'll find that book at BobBrubaker.com.
Well, thank you for joining us for the Power Break podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review wherever you've downloaded the podcast, and check out show notes, news, Bob's weekly blog, and other cool things at BobBrubaker.com. And listen next time for the Power Break podcast.